I'm in my container host that I use in my lab environment. Let me first clean up this environment. I'm going to start PowerShell as administrator. And if I type docker ps -a, you can find that I have a lot of containers that are in exited state. So over time, your lab environment will get dirty. So how can we clean them easily? If I type docker ps -a -q, you will get all the container IDs of the containers. So if you want to remove them in one shot, what you can do is type docker remove, and then you pass the output of the command docker ps -a -q. What it will do is it will remove all the containers that are in your machine in one shot. So if you type docker ps -a, you will find that all the containers are now gone. I now have a clean lab environment. What I'm going to do now is to go to my C drive in my lab machine and then create a folder called install. I'm going to copy two exe files, and the source of these exe files are given in your lab document. So copy those two exe files and then paste it in this C install folder. One of the exe application is called my batch app. The other one is called my super busy app. If you run my batch app, all what is it going to do is to print some numbers. And if you run my super busy app, you will find that it's going to type a lot of numbers. It's going to start multiple threads and then print those numbers, and it's going to use a lot of CPU. Do not use this super busy app frequently in these labs. If you do that, you will easily run out of your T2 instances CPU credit balances if you are using T2 instances. So I'm going to use my batch app application a lot in this exercise. I have started PowerShell as an administrator, and I'm going to start another PowerShell window as an administrator. I'm going to use the PowerShell window on my left-hand side to execute commands while being in the container host. And I'm going to use the PowerShell window on my right-hand side to start a container and execute commands related to that container. If I type docker ps -a, you can find that I don't have any containers in this machine. And if I type docker images, you can find I have an image called Microsoft Windows Server Core. Let me start a new container on my right-hand side PowerShell window. So I'm going to say docker run interactively Microsoft Windows Server Core. That's the base image I'm going to use. And inside that, I'm going to run PowerShell. That will start a new container. If I type hostname, you get the container ID. If I type docker ps, you can find that container is running with the ID 7E95. So the question now is, how can I copy these two files, my batch app exe and my super busy app exe, into the container with the ID 7E95? To do that, what I'm going to do is to execute a command called docker copy or docker cp, and you need to give it the source of the file. So in this case, I'm going to copy from C install, which is in my container host, a file called my batchapp.exe, and I want to copy it to the container instance with the ID 7E95. So let's make a directory called my app inside the container, and I will go inside this my app folder. So if you type dir, you will find that there's no files in that folder. So to copy this file from the container host, I need to find the container ID. So let me type docker ps. So you can find the container ID is 7E95, so which is same as the container on my right hand side. So let me type that command again, docker cp to copy, what I want to copy is inside this folder called C install, and the file name is mybatchapp.exe, and I want to copy it to the destination container 7e95. You can give part of the container ID as long as it distinguishes from rest of the containers. And inside that container, I created a folder called myapp. So that's where I want to copy it. So when I press enter, this mybatchapp.exe in the container host will get copied into the container. So if I type dir in the container, you can find that mybatchapp.exe is copied to the destination. So I'm going to execute the same docker copy command and then copy my superbc app also. Although we are not going to use my superbc app in this lesson, the image that we are going to create will have this my superbc app, and we will use it in later exercise in these labs. So copy it into the same folder, myapp. So if you type dir, you will have two exe applications under my app folder inside the container. How can we save the changes that I just made? To save changes, I'm going to use this command called docker commit. That will save the changes that I made to a container. So for example, if you type docker commit -- help, you get the help file for that commit. So you need to tell docker commit, container ID, repository name, and the tag. Let me clean this screen before we start typing the docker commit. So if you type docker ps, you get the container ID. And what I'm going to do now is to type docker commit followed by the container ID that I want to save. In this case, it's 7e95. And then I need to give the name of the image I want to use to save this container. It will give an error, and if you expand that error, you can see that it says that Windows does not support commit of a running container. So that's pretty obvious. You cannot save a running container. You first need to stop that container. So type docker stop and the container ID to stop that container before you commit the changes. You can find that the container exited. Now I can type docker commit followed by the, if I type docker ps, you will find that there's no any running containers, but you can find there's a container which has exited. I can save the changes in this exited container using docker commit. So let me type docker commit followed by the container IDs. In this case, it's 7e95. And then you need to give the name of the image that you want to save. So in this case, I want to save it as my batch app. And of course, you can give a tag like latest. This will save the changes that I made to that container. So if I type docker images, you'll find that it has created a new image called my batch app with the tag latest. Let me close this, the other window. We no longer need it. So I'm in my container host window. So let's clean the screen. And if I type docker images, you can find that I have the image that I created. The name of it is my batch app latest. So let's run this image. Running this image is similar to running Windows Server Core image. You type docker run, you can run it interactively with IT and then give the name of the image. In this case, I'm going to run my batch app latest. And inside this image, I have an application called my batchapp.exe under my app folder. So when I type enter, it will start this my batch exe. And like before, you can find that that worker is printing some numbers into the screen. The only difference here is that the work is now running inside a container. To stop this one, you can either type Ctrl+C, Control command, Control button and C to exit from that. Alternatively, you can type docker stop and then type the container ID. I have started a new PowerShell window as an administrator. If you type docker ps -a, you can find that I have cleaned up all the containers in this machine. And if you type docker images, you will find the image that I just created, my batch app latest image. In all the previous cases, when we ran a Docker container, we ended up giving the command that should run. So for example, you would probably write something like docker run interactively, name of the image, my batch app, and at the end you gave the command that should run. It could be my batch app exe or PowerShell. So is there a way that you can define a default command that should run when you run an image? So there are two options for that. One is to use this thing called cmd, where you define the default command. And the other one is to use this thing called the entry point, where you define the application that should run when you run that container. The difference between defining a command in the image and the entry point is that when you define a command, you can override which command it runs when you run the container. But in the case of entry point, the application that you define for the entry point execute regardless of whether you override it or not. So if you want to override what application run when you run that container, you need to go through some extra steps. So let's go and explore how to define command and entry point for an image. So here I type docker inspect my batch app image. And if you look carefully, you will find that the default command it's running is PowerShell. So under config, under cmd, what it runs by default is PowerShell. And there's no entry point defined. How can we define a command and an entry point for an image when we create an image? So let me start a container very quickly, and I'm going to base it out of my batch app image. And inside that, I'm going to run PowerShell. This is just to start a container and then to stop it, so that I will have a stopped container which I can use to create an image. So let me exit from that image so that I will have a exited container. You can find that I have a container called 2da, which is in exited state. And I'm going to use docker commit, but in this time I'm going to type something called -- change and the attribute that I want to change in the image. So I want to change the attribute cmd, and I want to provide the location of the exe that should run by default when this image is running. So I provide that attribute cmd, and then provide the name of the container or the ID of the container that I want to save. And finally, the name I should use, in this case ABC, for this image. So I save this image called ABC. If you type docker images, you will find an image called ABC. If you inspect that ABC image, you will find that under the command section, the default command is defined as c my app my batch app. Because this command is given, if you try to run this image without a command, it will start the default command that you have specified. So in this case, I'm going to run interactively ABC, but I'm not going to specify the command it should run. But because there's a command, the default command given in the image, it will start that command. You can find that the worker batch application is running. Let me type a Control-C to exit from this running process. Alternatively, you can type docker stop followed by the container ID to stop this container. And once I exit from this container, what you will find is that when you specify the command for an image, the user who is executing this image can still override it. So for example, if I run this ABC image, instead of using the default command, I can still run PowerShell as the default application. So it's now not going to run my batch app exe, but it now going to run PowerShell. How can you prevent this behavior, or how can you run an application regardless of what the user types at the end? So for that one, you are going to define the entry point. So if you type docker inspect abc, this is what we have defined, the command. What we need to define in this case is the thing called entry point. So if you define the entry point, that application is going to always run regardless of what you type in the docker run command. So if you type docker ps-a, I still have the image that I exited. So I'm going to commit this image. Like before, I'm going to define the change and the attribute that I want to change. In this case, it's going to be the entry point. And for the entry point, I'm going to define the same application, c:/my app, my batch app exe. Because you define the entry point, regardless of what command that you specify during docker run, it's always going to run this my batch app exe. Of course, you can change that behavior, but you need to go through some extra steps. So if I now type docker inspect abc2, you'll find that in abc2 image, I have defined the entry point as my batch app exe. So let's go there and then try to run this image that I just created called abc2, but without defining a command. So let's run with normal docker run. Name of the image, I'm going to run it interactively. Name of the image is abc2. Because I have defined an entry point, it's going to start that my batch app exe. The difference here compared to the CMD is that you cannot override it unless you go through some extra steps. So let me type Control C to exit from this running process. And if I type docker run interactively abc2, and if I type PowerShell, so in the command this PowerShell got overwritten, but because I have an entry point defined for this abc2 image, it's still going to run that my batch app exe when you run the container. So let me go and then type Control C to exit from this running process, or you can type docker stop the container ID and then clear the screen. I'm in my PowerShell again. If you type docker commit and then type help, you'll find that it has this option called -c or --change that you can use to change the attributes of the image. If you type docker inspect my batch app, so there are multiple attributes that you can change, things like the environment variables, the command, the volumes attached, the entry point. So there are multiple attributes that you can change for an image. So let's do a bit of cleanup of this lab environment. So if you type docker images, you will find there are 2 images that I just created. They are actually not needed. So I will try to remove them, docker remove image, abc, and it will give me an error saying that there are some containers already referring to this image. So you of course first need to remove those containers. No running containers, but there are some exited containers. So let's use this batch remove command to remove it. So docker remove followed by docker ps-a-q to remove all the containers in one shot. And now I'm going to remove the image of abc. It's successful, and I'm going to remove the image abc2. So time to time, it's better to clean the lab environment to keep it clean. So if I now type docker ps, no running containers, docker ps-a, no stop containers, docker images, you have this my batch app latest image, which we are going to use in the next lab.